Hey everybody, welcome back to my studio. I have been doing a lot of work lately playing around with colors and continuing to try to understand color better, which is one of my favorite things to do. And I've been particularly working on a new way of thinking about colors from an article that I read in Plein Air Magazine. And I wanted to share a little bit with you today about the approach that the writer recommends and what I've found as I'm testing it out. So let's go take a look. The idea is this. Having three triads, one for each value range. So a triad for my light values, a triad for my middle values, and a triad for my dark values will simplify urban sketching and create stronger compositions. And this idea came from this article in Plein Air Magazine. And you can see here, this is the introductory spread from the article by Vladislav Yeliseyev. I'm not really sure how you say the artist name, but he's clearly a very skillful artist. What drew me in, actually, what caused me to buy this magazine was his beautiful art on the cover, this gorgeous watercolor that appears to be Paris, if I had to guess, or someplace like Paris. And it's just an absolutely stunning, suggestive, impressionistic watercolor. It's the type of work I admire, and it's nothing like the work I produce, but maybe someday. And I thought, well, I want to know what this guy has to say about colors. And after reading the introduction, I was feeling pretty convinced that he was onto something. So, in the article, what he explains is that many of his students struggle when it comes to identifying the right colors and getting the right colors for the right value scheme. And I definitely relate to this. I've been doing a lot of monochrome studies where I work in only one color, and I'll make a rendering of a scene that I feel really happy with, and it works out great. I'm using like something really dark, like indigo, and I get the values down. I think the composition is strong. And when I go in there with color, I'm suddenly just absolutely flummoxed. And I end up usually with a scene that's way too colorful. So, the idea here behind the triads that the author is recommending is that they are triads that will produce a huge range of grays and will give us a lot of those really subtle colors, and we'll know which triad to choose based on the value plan that we have. So, for lit areas, bright areas of the scene, he's recommending that our triad is yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and cobalt blue. For mid-tone areas, he's got burnt sienna, a mix of alizarin crimson and dioxine violet, and ultramarine blue. And then for the dark areas, sepia, dioxine violet, and indigo. And you can see here in his mixes how this produces these interesting grays. I find interesting how many purples come out of this. I think this scheme really leads to purpley shadows, which I like. I thought this was very interesting, and I have all of these colors except for that violet. I do not have dioxazine violet. And I actually checked my Daniel Smith color. I have the Daniel Smith dots that lets you test every color. And they do not appear to make that color, but I do have quinacridone violet, and they look pretty similar. So I can work with that. Now, here is a scene I painted last June in Edinburgh, and I'm showing you this to show you what goes wrong in my urban sketching scenes. Now, look, a lot of things could be wrong here, so please don't judge too harshly. I'm sitting in the grass market. I'm looking up, I think this is Victoria Street, one of the many, many streets in Edinburgh and London that claims to be the inspiration for Diagon Alley in the Harry Potter series. And this scene, besides being really clunky, is way too colorful. I absolutely loved Edinburgh. I loved everything about Edinburgh, even the lousy weather. But it is not a super colorful city overall. It is kind of muted, and this scene is not muted and it's not subtle. And these are the types of problems I would like to avoid moving forward, that when I sit down, this particular street in Edinburgh does have a lot of color. These different houses and storefronts have a lot of color to them. But a more subtle rendering would be better, where I could add a splash of color and not have such bright color. So I was very intrigued by this idea of using 3 simple triads as the foundation of my sketch. So again, those recommended triads are yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and cobalt blue, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson mixed with violet, and ultramarine blue, and then sepia, violet, and indigo. And what I did is I went ahead and swatched these out and have them kind of lined up with each other to show that I can absolutely look at this and see how, if in a lit area I need a yellow and I use that yellow ochre, the shadow that complements that would be burnt sienna. Or if I'm doing a mid-tone and I need a darker shade, sepia would be a good shadow tone. So I can see how these line up really neatly here. And I went ahead and mixed all the grays to just get a sense of what is possible with this system. It's 9 colors, but it's really only 8 items for your palette, because one of the 9 colors is a mixture of alizarin crimson and violet. So, if you watched my video about my urban sketching palette, you'll know I have way more than 9 colors in my palette. I have like 21 colors maybe in my palette. And if you watched that video, you probably thought, girl, you got way too many colors, which is fair. I absolutely do not need that many colors in my palette, but I have room in my favorite travel palette for that many pans. So that's how many I'm going to have. And some of those colors I won't use that much, and eventually they'll get swapped out for other things. But I have on my palette versions of all of these colors. You can actually see here on the darks. I no longer in my urban sketching palette have sepia because I find it lifts too much. The sepia I have Blick's house brand. It's, Blick's artist grade watercolor in sepia, but it's really opaque and it lifts a lot, and I have trouble with it when I'm painting on location. And then I also don't have indigo in my urban sketching palette. I have it in my big home palette, but I do have Winsor & Newton Payne's gray in my urban sketching palette, which is very close to indigo. And I have raw umber, which is a similar brown to sepia. So the reason I have a 4th row of darks here is I decided to mix what I have on my actual urban sketching palette so that I could see if these combos would work when I'm out in the field, if that makes any sense. Having tested out the colors, I was really excited to go ahead and try them in an actual painting, and I wanted to do a scene that I've struggled with before to see if these colors could help me. I did not go so far as to redo the grass market sketch that I showed you a bit ago. That just seemed a little too complicated. But instead, I decided to work on this reference painting, or photo rather. So this is a reference photo that I took of a scene in Southwark in London last summer, and I really love the composition and shapes of this scene. I have tried to paint it before. I've tried twice, and both times my biggest challenge was with color. So here is the first time I tried to paint it, and this is in gouache. So if you watched my 20 days of gouache video, then you saw me struggle with this scene over the course of about 4 days, and this is where I gave up on it. My biggest problem and complaint using gouache for the scene was I absolutely could not get the colors right, and it was so annoying. And after failing with the colors in gouache, I actually redid it in watercolor, I had done the sketch initially on some really cheap watercolor paper, and I planned to do the gouache painting on that watercolor paper, but it got so smudgy because the drawing is so complicated that I ended up using tracing paper and moving the drawing over to different paper. But I still had the original smudgy watercolor painting, so I went ahead and drew with a fine liner over the original pencil lines, erased all the smudgy pencil, and then I painted it in with watercolor. And I like the watercolor version better-ish. However, the colors are just totally all wrong, and it was really annoying that even in watercolor, which is my usual medium, I just absolutely could not nail down these colors. So let's see what happened when I tried them with this new 8-color palette, and let's see if it could live up to its promises. All right, so here we have the end result of my efforts with this sympathetic set of triads. And I think it's fair to say that the subtlety of the colors is better than my gouache attempt and my previous watercolor attempt. Um, the colors are pretty grayed down. I had a lot of difficulty with the greenery here because the only yellow in this palette is yellow ochre, and yellow ochre doesn't make a real green when it's mixed with either cobalt or ultramarine. Instead, it makes a sort of grayish color. So there's a definite limitation. If you are painting a scene with a lot of foliage, you are going to need more yellows and maybe some greens on your palette, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Is this a great painting? No, please do not misunderstand me. I do not think this is a great painting, but I think it's a fairly successful use of this particular limited color palette. So let's talk about the pros here. First of all, the colors do work harmoniously together. So it was really nice to be able to just like dip into my palette, not really have to think at all about what colors I needed because the decisions were already made for me. And I knew the colors were going to play nicely together, and they have. So this does feel like a nice unified scene. As I already said, right, I didn't need to make any decisions. So this was really fast. The total painting time was about 40 minutes, not counting letting it dry. I did have to stop several times to let it dry because I was working with very wet washes in the early layers. And I'm trying to be a little looser and a little more spontaneous, and that means lots and lots of water. But 40 minutes, I mean, that's pretty good. The gouache painting took me, I don't know, an hour and a half over a few days. And basically, I only had to think about the value scheme. I didn't have to think about the color scheme, and that sped things up a lot. That's a real advantage for urban sketching because when you're out on location, there's a clock ticking, right? For me, an urban sketch, the amount of time I can spend from the time I say, leave my car, find a spot to start painting, sit down, do my studies, do my sketch, I have really about 2 hours max because let's face it, the bathroom clock is ticking. Like I'm going to need to go pee at some point, and that's probably my time limit. So when you only have a limited amount of time and you want to do all the work of value studies and understanding your composition and taking your time with all of that, then when it's time to lay down paint, to be able to do so quickly, to have already basically have all the color choices made for you and be able to work fast is a definite huge advantage. And the muted colors do feel realistic, even if they maybe deviate from the actual colors of the scene. I think actually, in fairness, these colors don't even deviate that much from my reference photo. For a true urban scene with lots of architecture, with lots of brick and stonework, this color palette makes a ton of sense. If you are doing a landscape with lots and lots of trees and foliage and gardens, this palette won't really make any sense. But if you're doing a lot of architecture, I think there's some real value here into this combination of 8 colors. That said, there were some definite cons, as already discussed, right? You have a very limited ability to mix greens. I will say the article in Plein Air Magazine does comment on this, that no, you can't really get away with only these 8 colors and no additional colors. There's a few different ways you could solve it. In this case, there are 3 blues on the palette, right? Cobalt, Ultramarine, and Indigo. So if you just added one other yellow, like a cadmium yellow or a Hansa yellow, you could mix a lot of greens with those blues. So that would be one solution, is just add another yellow. You could also add, a sap green or a viridian or some other green and use that as your mixing color. If you've watched my urban sketching palette video, I actually have 3 greens on there. I have sap green, serpentine green genuine, and Paraline green. And the reason I have 3 greens is the speediness that I mentioned on the previous slide. When I'm out there on location, I need to be able to work really quickly and make decisions quickly. And while it's great to be able to mix all your own greens, and I know there are loads of artists out there who say, like, you always have to mix your own greens. You should never use green from tubes. It has to be, your greens are going to be boring if you don't mix them yourself. Fair enough, if that's what you're going for, but you can liven up your tube greens really easily by adding yellow and blue to the paint from the tube to change it and modify it, dropping in some burnt sienna or red to liven it up. You can do a lot with paints from the tube or from the pan, and it's going to save you a ton of time for plein air work when you're out there on location. So maybe in my studio, I would go ahead and mix all my greens from scratch, but when I'm on the run and I'm trying to get a painting done quickly, and I live in a very green part of the world, from spring till fall, this New England is a very green place. I need a lot of green options and I need to be able to use them quickly. So you really cannot get away with just these 8 pigments. Fortunately, most palette boxes give you room for at least 12, and that's plenty of space to add in some more yellows or greens or some of what I call my cheater colors that save me time on location. And the other challenge for me, and I think I could get better at this over time with this palette, is that the colors do end up being extremely muted in this palette. And so that means you want to plan your composition really carefully to have some kind of focal point where you can put that strong pop of red or blue straight out of the tube to give some interest and contrast because it is extremely muted. Like, I love color to a fault. Go back and see my grass market sketch for proof. I maybe like color just a little too much. But for me, to use this combination all the time, I think I would get really bored because it's so sort of somber. But again, for architecture, for working fast, for getting the basic colors and values on the page, I think this is a really interesting way to think of color, to simplify your choices to a light, mid, and dark triad and just run with that and let the decisions be made for you. I've never heard of working this way. I've heard of working with only, just a triad plus maybe, one other color or whatever. But I've never heard of working where you have 3 triads that are built to work together. And I find that extremely fascinating. And it's something I'm going to play with more. So I would say give these colors a try. If you do, let me know. Tell me what you think down in the comments. And happy painting.